Peter C. Is a professor of psychological brain sciences at Dartmouth who investigates the neural basis of consciousness. He received his PhD from Harvard, working with Patrick Kavanagh and Ken Nakayama, and later did a postdoc with Nikos Logothetis before joining the faculty at Dartmouth in 2001. I first became aware of Peter's work based on his winning entries in the Best Visual Illusion of the Year contest, where he wowed audiences with infinite regress illusion, attentional modulation of color, and attention-based motion. And he also recently demonstrated an effect dubbed Back from the Future, where participants can control the interpretation of an ambiguous motion stimulus with a cue that comes after the motion stimulus, which is pretty crazy stuff. So today he's going to be talking about what makes the human mind human. So please join me in welcoming Peter C.
Okay, hey everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. So I'm a little bit not as tech savvy as I should be. Hold on. So now, okay, I can see. You can't see what I'm doing. Do I have the right to share?
You should, yeah.
Can you record? You are recording?
I'm recording. If you see the green share button, there you go.
Okay. Can you see now what I see?
Yes.
Okay, so hold on. Let me get this right. Get full screen. Oh, hold on. Now, is it full screen? Is it being blocked for you guys?
Full screen, no blocks.
All right, all right. So, you know, I want to talk about really what made the human mind human. And, you know, most of my work is pretty much driven by first a lot of thinking and ideas, and only later do we come to experiments. So I'm always bugging my students, you know, like, what's the question? What's the question? So we don't fall into the trap of just doing some incremental thing or some thing that is not rooted in some deep question. And so there's a lot of deep questions, you know, and I think most of them are not answered in our field. You know, some of them are like, why do we dream? Why do we sleep? Then there's hard ones like, what is consciousness? What is it for? What's the neural code? But the question I want to ask today is what made us human? In particular, what made our minds so just insanely free compared to, say, a chimp, right? So we have a last common ancestor with a chimp, you know, 7 million years ago. It's nothing really. And chimps don't do much. You know, sorry, chimps, but, you know, like they get rained on all the time. And no chimp has ever invented an umbrella. They just look miserable. Every human society has invented raincoats and umbrellas and shoes and all the basic stuff, and then airplanes. And, you know, how did that happen? So I'm going to make an argument that something really fundamental changed in our brains. And I'm not going to actually talk about language, which is sort of the crown jewel in our nervous system, because I think something happened before that, of which language later was an expression. All right, so some of these things I'll talk about now are part of a MOOC, a massive open online course that I produced 2018 concerning free will in the brain. And I advocate a kind of libertarian free will, which many philosophers don't agree with. They don't see a way around determinism or how we could possibly choose to become a new kind of chooser in the future. So I'm going to try to unpack that a bit. I wrote a book in 2013 about a first kind of free will, which you can call type 1 free will, which is something we have in common with a tiger or a dog or a bear, which is the ability to weigh options internally, to consider those options in light of reasons, and then select them in a manner that the outcome could turn out otherwise. So even a tiger, for example, can look at a tapir in the Sumatran jungle and say, you know, I want to get that tapir. Well, if I go that way, it's shorter but noisier. If I go that way, it's more, you know, it's faster, but, you know, so there's pluses and minuses. It can weigh its options. But what a tiger can't do is say, you know, next year I want to be a different kind of tiger. I want to be a tiger that eats fewer tapirs and more pangolins. You know, no tiger does that. They're much more bound by instinct. Anyway, so in this book, I really get into the neural code, which is something I'm very interested in. And I reached the conclusion that really Ludwig Wittgenstein was really one of the first people to get it, that what's going on is a criterial assessment of something. So he asked questions like, what counts as a game, or what counts as a bird, or what counts as someone who looks, Finnish? And what you end up with is something he called family resemblances. So here are a bunch of Laplanders, right? So, what is it that defines Laplanders? Well, you might say they all have, this kind of nose. Well, let me ask another. What makes someone look Scandinavian? Well, you might say they're all blonde. I'll say, well, that one has black hair. Well, they all have a certain kind of nose. Well, no, that one has a different kind of nose, right? So there's no necessary or sufficient condition for looking Scandinavian. There might be, say, 10 criteria, and you only need 5 of which to count as looking Scandinavian. But this person meets those 5, this person meets those 5, this person meets those 5, and you end up with this huge, essentially infinite set of an equivalence class of things that count as Scandinavian, but they look radically different from each other. Anyway, so neurons are doing something like this. They're setting criteria for their inputs. And so a neuron might respond identically to lots of different instances of a cat, for example, if it's a cat detector. Anyway, so that's this book. I'm now writing another book concerning the kind of free will that really defines humans, which is this capacity to imagine different future scenarios and then realize them, including envisioning a new self. So for example, envisioning that next year I'll be able to speak Swahili. So I'll say, well, I don't speak Swahili now, but what do? I can go get a book on Amazon and start teaching myself and taking courses and da-da-da. And then in a year, I'm kind of adequate at Swahili. So I'm a new kind of nervous system now that can process Swahili, whereas now I cannot. Anyway, there's lots of instances of this in humans, and I think in humans only. So we have this capacity to imagine futures and then realize them. So really what the talk today is about is where our imagination comes from. And at the end, I'll get into MRI, but mostly I want to talk about ideas. Where does our imagination come from? So here's Michelangelo's drawing of, we seem to have this sort of an angel blowing crazy stuff into our heads, and we're imagining all kinds of stuff. Some of it's pretty horrible and dark. But chimpanzees don't seem to have this capacity to imagine even an umbrella, let alone go about fashioning it. This is, what was his name? Anyway, this is the kind of stuff that we can imagine. Hieronymus Bosch, back in the Middle Ages. Okay, so, a lot of my thinking starts to ask questions like, what are the ideas that govern our way of thinking? And there's this beautiful book by Lakoff and Johnson, Metaphors We Live By. I recommend all of their work. And if you ask that question about our field, you quickly realize that there's a governing metaphor in our field, which is the brain is a computer. But this is a terrible metaphor. It's wrong. For one thing, there's just vast differences between our brains and computers, right? So computers are not conscious, right? They don't have states like hunger or sleepiness. There's no hardware software distinction in us, whereas, if there were, I'd download Swahili. Our neural code seems to be very criterial. So a given response it's not deterministic. It's not even algorithmic, I would argue, whereas a CPU takes a single input and chooses in a binary way, yes or no. Our neurons take hundreds, if not thousands of inputs and decide in this criterial way, which is very loosey-goosey. And on top of it, there seems to be a harnessing of randomness. So there's all kinds of examples I could give you where I would argue quantum domain effects, the truly random processes in the universe affect the outcome at a macroscopic level of neural function. And, if that is correct, and I think it is correct, then, neurons are also not algorithmic in the sense that they are harnessing true randomness. And so I would argue the brain is not reducible to a Turing machine. It's harnessing something that's inherently not computable, but I won't go off in that direction. Anyway, our brains function in this radically different way, and we in our field are misguided by a bad metaphor. Anyway, another metaphor that governs our thinking is the brain as a graph. which is sort of like thinking of it as having these nodes and these connections or edges between these nodes. And implicit in that metaphor is something like the brain as a highway. So if you want to understand what's connected with what, Chicago's connected to New York, but these highways, I can look at the size of the highways, maybe even measure traffic. But maybe the metaphor is faulty in that the brain is much more like a train track system where any given bit of track can be part of lots of different connectivities, right? So a little stretch of track in Ohio might connect you to Boston to Seattle, or New York to Toronto, or Schenectady to San Diego, right? This piece of track is not inherently linked between its destinations and sources because of this dynamic shunting. And I want to argue that neurons are doing something very similar with their rapid dynamic synaptic weight changes, especially rooted in the opening of NMDA receptors, which are blocked by a single magnesium ion, whose release will then be a quantum domain effect. Anyway, I won't get too deeply into this. Right. So, there's some useful parts of this, like there are hubs and so forth. But really what we need to think about is not patterns of connectivity, but the operations that happen at different locations. So for example, people who think about the brain in terms of a graph don't really think about operations happening at a given hub location. So imagine if you get on a plane in San Francisco, and then you fly to Atlanta and it turns you into a Klingon, and then you fly to New York and you leave it looking like an elf, right? There's this thing that happens at this hub that transforms you. So operations are truly central to the way the brain works, and the notion of operations is really in neither of those two metaphors, but especially not in this most popular metaphor right now. Anyway, so let's talk about mental operations. There's lots of different kinds. Some of them are pre-conscious, bottom up, and they go into the construction of your consciousness. And I've spent the past 30 years trying to tease apart what some of those operations might be. Like that, you probably can't help but see that as the little guy in the middle holding the two guys on the side. That image on the upper right, that's just two images back and forth, but your brain constructs in a bottom-up way a story or a narrative whereby that bar, which in fact comes on all at once, seems to shoot out of it and shoot into the little element on the left. And this is another example of something that seems to be driven entirely by the stimulus, right? So these two little white arrows point to blocks of color that are identical in the image, and you might not believe that, but if you move them over, you can see they are in fact the same in the image, but what you consciously experience is radically different, right? You cannot reach down into the image because what you experience is post-operation. It's post-color constancy operation. So your conscious contents are pre-conscious operations. Okay, but then there are these sort of operations that are in fact amenable to top-down influence, including volitional influence over what you will subsequently see. And so Nick talked about this study. Well, okay, here's an example, right? If you fixate the little dot in the middle, you can volitionally attend to any of those disks, and what you might find subjectively in your phenomenology is that the one that you choose to attend to volitionally seems to change its quality, its brightness. It seems to me, for example, if I attend to the upper left one, to be brighter or lighter. It seems to shift to the back. It seems to become more opaque. So your volition can actually change the outcome of subsequent bottom-up operations. So there's this beautiful interplay between consciousness and the unconscious, symbiotic really, and these volitional decisions you make with your conscious system can alter the bottom-up processing. So it's simply not the case that consciousness is the passive recipient of unconscious processes that well up, and that your volition has no role in the outcomes of your consciousness or your life. Okay, so here's a famous example of what's called quartets, and people see this either moving vertically or horizontally, and you can will, if you have a strong will, to see it one way or the other. Or say you want to see it go horizontally, cover the bottom two with your hand, And if you want to see it go vertically, cover the right 2 with your hand, and then take your hand away, and you'll see one versus the other. So there's no vertical or horizontal only input here. It's a construction of these bottom-up processes. But again, these bottom-up processes are subject to some degree of volitional control. So in this study, my student Li Wei Sun created a tiny version of these little quartets right at fixation. And people had headphones on, and there was a tone that was either, well, depended on the subject, but it might be like boop means try to see it go vertically. And boop, it might mean try to see it go horizontally. And there were catch trials, you can see those in the dotted lines there, where the motion was forced to go one way or the other. And so only those people who were honest on what they were forced to see, so on catch trials, did we analyze further. So now, before we told people what the meaning of those tones, boop versus boop, of course, they would just see, you know, whatever, you know, they see vertical or horizontal. So consistent means like boop would mean consistent with vertical, because boop meant vertical. So of course there are chants because they don't know what the command means, right? Then we told them, okay, here's the command. When you hear boop, try to see it go vertically, and boop, try to see it go horizontally, and they could do it above chance, right? And the crazy thing is they could even do it after the switched from this to this happened in the world. So this is pretty crazy, right? So it means that, you know, in this case, 100 something milliseconds, 150 milliseconds after the event in the world, volition could reach down into a preconscious buffer and alter the operation there such that you would see what you willed to see. Now, we sent this to the reviewers, I think it was Vision Research, and they were like, come on, I don't believe it. This is backward causation in time. And it's not backward causation in time because you've got this preconscious buffer that might last on the order of 300 milliseconds that then creates what you will subsequently see. So they said, you got to redo it. And this, we ran like 80 subjects, and so we redid it. Okay, so this is different subjects. And then we redid it. And this time I said, let's even do it further out. Let's see how far we can get out. And this time we got out to like, I can't remember, like 300 milliseconds. So up to 300 milliseconds after the event in the world, your volition can reach down into the processing of this preconscious buffer and alter what you will subsequently, subjectively experience in your consciousness, either vertical or horizontal. Anyway, but that's not what the talk is about, right? So the talk is about mental operations, but not these kinds. It's really focused on this third kind, the volitional operations over conscious operands that take place in our internal working memory or our internal imagination or internal virtual reality. So that's what I really want to focus on today. So, you know, we do this stuff all the time, but I can give you a command like, you know, imagine an egg with wings flying around the Statue of Liberty who's holding an ice cream cone instead of a torch. And, you know, you download these kind of things and boom, and then there's operations. You've got to attach wings to the egg and put an ice cream cone into her hand. And then you can even make the whole thing animated. So, you know, a very simple act of imagination like that can involve lots of operands, lots of operations, you know, all of which have to be essentially downloaded into some kind of mental workspace so that you can put them together correctly to fulfill that goal, which I gave you in this case. But, you know, you're doing this all the time yourself. And it's not always this highly creative, weird stuff like, you know, in flying egg around the Statue of Liberty. It could just be something, you know, like an everyday thing. So you take this random person and they're told, you know, let's have some people over for dinner. Okay. So this person sits and thinks, okay, we got a table, we got 6 seats. Okay, who can we invite? Well, okay, dinner, I don't know. Okay, let's invite these friends. Okay, well, but that guy, he dumped Sheila there to his, so let's cut him out. And she hates him. And I never liked that guy anyway. You know, anyway, so he's out. Who could we invite? Okay, well, I could try to set Sheila up with somebody. What about Dr. Singh from the chemistry department? Yeah, maybe he's a little odd, but let's give him a shot. You know, okay, so now we put him in. It's a mental operation. Oh, great, this guy's vegetarian. Okay, what can I make? Okay, all right. How about falafel? Well, falafel's not, it's a little low class. Okay, how about spinach lasagna? Well, it's a little higher class, but okay, let's just go with that. I don't have time. Okay, what ingredients we got in the fridge? We got, oh, we don't have spinach and we don't have, okay, they're gotta go to the supermarket then. They gotta get to the car. Let's go to that one. Where's my keys? Like that's how human minds work, right? We deliberate and come up with all this stuff. Our imagination is, this tremendous tool that allows us to do stuff and change the world, like, make lasagna and not falafel. So I'm very interested in this question of where our imagination comes from, but also why we follow certain imagination paths versus others. Okay, so now getting more into the nitty-gritty, I want to talk about evolution first, and then I want to talk about some MRI studies. So let's begin by talking about the imagination. What do we mean by imagination as opposed to just mental imagery? Well, usually people talk about nouns of the mind. We imagine a hammer, a face, the dress, a house, scenes. And people in our field are very consumed with the nouns of the mind, faces, objects, scenes. It's almost boring. We need to focus as a field more on the verbs of the mind, which do stuff like mental rotation, putting things together, taking them apart, substitution, all kinds of stuff, right? We're not just nouns of the mind, we're verbs of the mind, and they interact, right? You can't have one without the other. So this is a huge future direction for our field, is to really zoom in on these kinds of operations. And then the deep question is where they came from and how we can do stuff that a chimp can't. So I'll just define imagination as operations over operands in an internal mental workspace or virtual reality. So really consciousness is bifurcated, or you might say trifurcated, right? We have dreams, which is one thing. 1/3 of your life is in sleep. But in your waking life, you've got this bifurcated consciousness, which is sort of perception out there. And then you have this internal virtual reality. And this, it's probably not a coincidence that we're toggling back and forth, right? So all this mind wandering stuff, from Jonathan Schooler and others at Santa Barbara, we are either in this internal virtual reality, mind wandering, or even volitionally processing things in a deliberative way in our internal virtual reality, which is what I'm going to focus on, not mind wandering. Or we're kind of engaging with the world. And so we toggle back and forth. So it's not a coincidence that our frontal parietal network is sort of in this anti-correlated behavior with the default mode network. Okay, so here's Tetsuro Matsuzawa, who recently got fired, believe it or not. Anyway, he has done this incredible work. I mean, really one of the, probably the leading chimp researcher in the world. And he has, his group, I should say, has looked at the working memory capacity of chimps. So there's a chimp here, I think his name is Akuma or something, or Ayuma. Anyway, the chimp can learn human numbers and the sequence of them. I doubt it knows the meaning of the numbers, but anyway, it knows that first comes 1 and then comes 2. And so the Matsuzawa group flashes these numbers for, say, I don't know, 500 milliseconds thing, covers them up, and then the chimp has to press them in sequence, and they can do this, which humans can't do. Like their performance is better than ours. So it's not a working memory capacity issue, right? What it sets us apart from chimps is not working memory capacity. If you want, I could show this. Might as well. It's only a minute. I don't know what happened. So I think this is pretty mind-blowing. I mean, the chimpanzee can remember not only 17 things, but where they are in their sequence. Human performance would be way worse than this. Okay, so this is the Okay, stop. All right. So, 20 million years ago or so, we branched off from something that probably looked quite a lot like a gibbon. And our ancestors might have actually been swinging through trees. And that's why our, what do you call this? Rib cage is shaped like this and not like this, like a dog. Like a dog is like this and we're like this, probably because at some stage we were doing this. But then some branch of these lower apes, branched off into these much bigger animals. And we branch off from the orangutans, I don't know, 16 million years ago, from the gorillas, 9 million years ago, from the chimps. People don't know exactly, 7 million years ago. And then there was this crazy branching where all these hominins lived, many of them at the same time, and we are the sole remaining species of that branching. Some beautiful reconstructions. So a modern day chimp had a brain pretty similar to Australopithecus, and even the skull shape was pretty similar. So we definitely branch off of something that was pretty chimp or bonobo-like 7 million years ago. And the question is why we changed so much. Well, I'll get, so if you look at our branching, even though we're the only extant species, there were just probably dozens, if not, scores of branches. And it has turned out that we are actually the inheritors of lots of these branches. I mean, I don't know if you've heard about the whole Denisovans thing, but if you haven't, it's pretty amazing. So the Neanderthals and Denisovans branch off from each other, I don't know, 400,000 years ago. And we have genes from both of them. So when our ancestors came out of Africa on the order of 70,000 years ago, let's just put it this way, sex happens, and so then here we are the inheritors of a bunch of these species, and maybe there might be some Homo erectus in us too. And the question is, what got this all off the ground? I mean, it seems to be climactic, is that the right? Climate changes that led to this. The drying of the jungles in East Africa and the formation of savannas forced the hominins that were living there to be living on savanna and eating maybe grains, grass, and who knows. But it led to bipedality, which was this huge innovation that preceded all the other innovations. And that was probably driven by climate change. So this is Afarensis, maybe I'd say 3.5 million years ago, Africanus, maybe 2.5, 3 million years ago. This is the Paranthropus genus, not Australopithecus. And we don't descend from them. So they didn't get to become our ancestors. They were sort of giant vegetable chomping versions. But habilis, is the first member of our genus. And they used to think it was the first that made tools about 2.2 million years ago. Then came Erectus, 1.8 million years ago. And then Heidelbergensis, maybe 800,000 years ago or so. And Neanderthals and Denisovans and we descend from Heidelbergensis, and Erectus and habilis. And then Chuck Norris does too. Okay, so then here we are. Okay, so now, and our species is very diverse. We have all kinds of people still existing. Let me just quickly tell you about the Denisovans because they're just so awesome, right? So in 2010 or so, this amateur paleontologist was walking through the Altai Mountains. He's looking for caves, and he finds this pinky bone in this cave, and he can't figure out. He says, this guy was good enough to say, this is not a Neanderthal pinky bone. I don't know what it is. So he sends it to Moscow. They don't know what it is. They send it to Svante Pabo, who heads the Human Evolution Max Planck in Leipzig, who will get a Nobel Prize, along with David Reich, I assume, soon. And they bore a little hole into this pinky bone, and they get the whole genome of this thing. And they say, yeah, it's not Neanderthal. It is something else that diverged from the Neanderthals 450,000 years ago or so. And they have yet to find a bone, the skull of this, right? So, but they have the whole gene. And then this is what makes the difference between like great scientists and then super great scientists. Like this guy, Svante Pabo, then goes and looks at the whole human genome of people who are alive now and finds out that Australians, Aborigines, and Papua New Guinea people are up to 6% Denisovan, in addition to already being 2% Neanderthal. So this is just amazing stuff. Anyway, I won't go off on that sidetrack, but pretty amazing stuff. Right, and then there's this Homo floresiensis, which they found lived on the island of Flores and really only seems to have gone extinct some few tens of thousands of years ago. So it's really a crazy situation. Anyway, so the first innovation is bipedality, probably as long ago as 6 million years ago. You know, there's a Sahelent, I forget the name, Chadensis was a bipedal already, but very much like a chimp that was bipedal. Might very well be an ancestor of ours. This is, I'm sorry, this is probably Afarensis or Africanus. This is what Lucy was, I think, is about 3 million years ago. Okay, so then, you know, like I said, they used to think that the first tools were made by habilis, but now they've found that there were tools that long precede our genus Homo, probably made by Australopithecines. So this is found in Kenya 3.3 million years ago. Now it's not much, you know, but the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And so they might have kind of been bashing stones together, but it's clear from the wear patterns that they were using them for something. And these tools are actually more complicated than you would think. It's not just bashing stones together, because there's evidence that they would nap the stone. They could break it and then twist it and break it and twist it and break it, which is a form of imagination, right? You have to imagine a tool and then go about making it, you know? So this might be the beginning of how this all got off the ground, these complex mental operations. I mean, I'll talk about this later in the talk, but we have these incredibly, what's the word, dexterous hands that afford these kinds of operations in the world with our body, right? Like, so let's say you're a cow and you've got this hoof. Well, what am I gonna do with my hoof? Well, I'm not gonna do much because there's not much you can do with a hoof other than stand on it. So the incredible dexterity of our mental operations, I would suspect, is rooted in the incredible dexterity of our hands, especially. And then we could internalize that in this notion of embodied cognition. But I'll get to that later. Anyway, so then about 2.2 million years ago, you have the Oldowan tool set. You know, it doesn't look like much progress, but still there's intentionality behind the creation of these tools, as evidenced by napping. And then there's this huge breakthrough with erectus, our ancestor Homo erectus. 2 million years ago, 1.8 million years ago, they find this incredible hand axe called the Acheulean hand axe. And it's found everywhere where Homo erectus lived. And what's crazy about it is that it kind of looks the same over this vast duration, from 1.8, 1.6 million years ago to about 200,000 years ago, when they might have gone extinct. Although some people argue they might have gone extinct much more recently than 200,000 years ago. Anyway, it was almost like they had a template in their head for this teardrop-shaped thing. This is where they lived, and you know, there are other animals that have a template in their head, like bowerbirds. You know, did we have a template for this thing? But what's most striking about this is that there was essentially no innovation, right? They had this one good idea and they just stuck with it for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. It's a mystery, right? Because you would think if you could do that, you could do all kinds of other stuff, but they don't find other stuff. They find this, right? They don't find tools with parts or different kinds of tools. It's just this. So yeah, they have this capacity to imagine something and then build it, but it might have been like bowerbirds. It might not have had this innovativeness that defines our species. Here's just another example. Okay, so a Homo erectus brain was, well, smaller than ours, but they were starting to get pretty big brains, like up to 1,000 cc, cubic centimeters, maybe even 1,100, some of the bigger ones, whereas ours are on the order of 1,350 cubic centimeters. Some people have really big brains, like 1,600 cubic centimeters. Anyway, but there are some claims in the literature that maybe Homo erectus actually, you know, wasn't as uninnovative as I'm saying. You know, they're claiming that these scratches on this clam are evidence of art. You know, I don't know. It's almost like the exception that proves the rule. They don't find other Homo erectus art, and this is pretty piddling. I don't know, call me arrogant. Okay, Anyway, again, so what led to this great change in our brain sizes? Again, it might have been climate change, where you had these, in that pink band there, you have this huge fluctuation in the climate, savanna formation, jungles are back, savanna formation, ice ages, and that probably drove a lot of the need to become smarter. But it might not only have been externally caused. Those green bars represent, the span. So time is on the x-axis, and then you can see that over hundreds of thousands of years that the brains are getting bigger. Actually, Neanderthals had bigger brains than us, and yet we probably played a role in, well, annihilating them and to some degree subsuming them. So, take the Neanderthals, right? So we could mate with them. We had babies with them, right? Our species. So it's not like a species like a bird and a donkey, right? I mean, these were not just our cousins, right? We were very closely related. And yet, if you look at their tool set called the Mousterian tool set, it was much more advanced than the Homo erectus Acheulean tool set, but it didn't change very much. Over tens and tens of thousands of years, it kind of very, very slowly changed. So again, there seemed to be kind of this lack of innovation that our species just, every generation, our species is coming up with new stuff. Now there's some debate about who made this art. Some people are arguing Neanderthals did make art, and yeah, maybe they did, This is a bunch of stalactites or mites that they find in the bottom of this cave in France that were arranged in a circle, probably done by Neanderthals. Our species was not there yet. Our species reaches, well, Europe en masse, like 43 to 41,000 years ago. They've actually found evidence that the Neanderthals might have been making strings, might have had clothing, so they were probably much more similar to us than we usually think. And certainly you wouldn't want to mate with somebody who was not just, a member of your species. So clearly, since we're part Neanderthal, about 2%, however that sex happened, they regarded each other as potential mates. Okay, so our species seems to branch off from Heidelbergensis in Africa about 320,000 years ago or so. Initially, they thought that this skull was Neanderthal, but they later classified it as a very, very early human. It's up there in the upper left in Morocco, the Jebel Irhoud site. It's about 315,000 years ago. And this is a reconstruction. It's another reconstruction. They made a tool set that was not more advanced than the Neanderthals. But this person might be, that might actually be a representation of our ancestors about 315,000 years ago. But if you think about it, about 300,000 years ago, there were lots of different species alive at the same time. And it was a bit like Lord of the Rings, where you have lots of different kinds of human-like things alive at the same time. So it's a very different world. But I'm going to focus now on our species, right? So here's our species showing up in, say, Germany around 43 to 41,000 years ago, and we're just radically different. We might have come up the Danube, and then you can't go any further beyond a little place called Donaueschingen in Germany. So south of Tübingen, they have found all these caves in this region called Hohenzollern, and they find in these caves crazy, amazing stuff, like that bison. And, the stone tools are not so impressively different from the Mousterian, but there's art, and it's just art all over the place. So there's something going on in our minds that leads to this explosion of art. Now, it didn't start in Europe, right? They brought it with them. It started almost surely in Africa. But here's some of these things from Germany. Yeah, so that one on the right is one I really like. It's called the Löwenmensch, or the Lion Man. It could be as old as 40,000 years old. And, somebody had to download into their working memory a lion's head and a human body and stick them together and then make this thing before they did it, right? So there's that kind of imagination seems to be just new in the artifact record. There seems to be the emergence of symbolic processing. Who knows what this means? Those phases of the moon, but something's going on. And these are things from Africa about 70 to 80,000 years ago that seem to be more or less the beginnings of this. There's some real puzzles, right? So anatomically, our species starts to look more or less like us easily by 120,000 years ago, maybe even, you could even say 200,000 years ago. If you took a person from 200,000 years ago and they were walking down the street in a suit, you wouldn't really even notice. But the behavior changes around 80,000 years ago. So why was there this long time where anatomically we look the same, and yet behaviorally, it seems there was this big bang in terms of creativity? Nobody knows. First jewelry emerges, and this is from the Blombos Cave, 75,000 years ago. This might be an exception. This is from the Congo. They're not sure how old this thing is, but if it is as old as some people think, then it's evidence that we were more advanced than the artifact record shows. Okay, so then, things that are claimed to be art from, longer ago than 200,000 years ago. Well, there's this pebble from Israel that some people are saying is the first sculpture, but look at that thing in the upper left. I mean, come on. And then compare it with a modern human's art. This is from about 30,000 years ago. I'd say it's so different as to be just a difference in kind. So what led to that change? And then if you look at all this stuff made by our species, once they come into Europe, there's instruments, there's, who knows what all these Venuses are? Could it be some religion, some Pleistocene porno? Who knows? Anyway, so this is the one I like the best because it entailed, downloading into your working memory a lion's head and a human body and sticking them together and then fashioning it. There's nothing like this before our species. So the question is, what happened in our brains to afford this? What kind of mental operations could afford this? And then I would say it is those same mental operations that led to the great works of art and science and our incredible creativity. Well, something happened in our brains. I mean, you can see as we go from Homo erectus in front to Heidelbergensis to Neanderthals in the back there, our brains are certainly getting bigger. Our foreheads are getting bigger. And if you compare a Neanderthal on the left there with a human, looks like Bono to me, on the right, you can see our foreheads are just really big. So something's going on with this frontal lobe. So even though Neanderthal brains were bigger than ours, whatever happened in our lineage, I suspect, happened in part because of these working memory areas and executive control areas in the frontal lobes. And you can see on the far right there that Neanderthals had some of them had 1,800 cubic centimeter brains, really, really big brains, even though they were shorter than us and, well, they were stocky. So it's not a size issue, right? It's also not a working memory capacity issue because the chimps have this greater working memory capacity. It's something to do with what we are doing in our working memory and or mental workspace. So, if you take a chimp brain and you blow it up 3 times, so from about 400, say, cubic centimeters up to 1,200 cubic centimeters. So you've normalized the chimp brain and a human brain. Some areas are smaller than they should be in that comparison, like V1, but the prefrontal areas are more than double what they should be if it's just a question of size. But all mammals have a prefrontal cortex, so it's not that we have a prefrontal cortex, it's what we're doing with it. And I would argue we're doing these crazy, amazing mental operations. And, another cause of this might not have just been climate change. It might have been sexual selection, right? So these giant foreheads we have might be something like our peacock's tail, right? So presumably peahens find beautiful, huge tails attractive, which leads to not natural selection, which is sort of weeding out the left end of the bell curve. It's sexual selection, which is weeding in the right end of the bell curve, right? So if you find that attractive, you're going to end up with a peacock. Well, sexual selection in mammals and birds tends to be the males displaying or competing, and then the females selecting. I'm going to mate with you and not you. And so and I don't know if this is true, but if human females have a preference for working memory operations, like, maybe expressed through humor, language, intelligence, music, I don't know. This could become like a peacock's tail. We'd end up with a giant capacity for creativity and executive control. But who knows? It's hard to do nail this down as a scientific experiment because you can't go into the past, but it's a possibility. Anyway, so here's what I think might have happened. You've all heard about mental modularity. It's kind of the view that the brain has these modules that do things, sort of like a Swiss Army view. Really, Tooby and Cosmides at Santa Barbara took the lead on this view. There might be submodules. But, if you read Fodor's book, Mental Modularity, he says, there are these modules that are dedicated, fast, operate in parallel, they're encapsulated. But then there are these other processes that seem to be central that have the opposite properties. They're slow, serial, not parallel, not dedicated, they're domain general, and they're not encapsulated. And people have focused a lot on the modularity side of it, but focused much less on the domain general aspect. Anyway, so I'd like to argue that something happened in our working memory or mental workspace circuitry that afforded these really cool operations. It's probably rooted in changes in the circuitry associated with volitional attention. So this is the work of Kahneman and Treisman and others. Attention is somehow tied up with an object file in working memory. And what is that? Some sort of file that represents all the things about something you're attending. Like, oh, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. So everything changed, right? The location changed, the name changed, the features changed, everything. The only thing that's constant is that you're attending to it and are representing it. So I don't know, a while ago I wrote something about this, and I wanted to argue that object files change because of changes in attentional circuitry, permitting the first symbolic reference in working memory. So, a macaque can look at a banana and it can represent in its working memory object file, well, certainly the banana, and maybe, things that it has associated with a banana, like a location, but we can look at a banana and also at the same time have it represent, anything, work, or kid, anything. We have this sort of ability to point to something that something itself is not. So how does that get off the ground? I would argue you would need to represent the two things, the thing that is the symbol or the icon plus what it's pointing to and hold them together. And you can imagine how this new architecture might lead to a form of insanity, right? Like if you think, the banana is in fact your son, you would go nuts, right? So you need to have now reality tags. Like, okay, the banana might be real and this is pointing to my son and that, So I think it's not a coincidence that our brains can break down in ways that chimp brains cannot. So for example, there's no evidence that chimps can get schizophrenia or have bipolar disorder. There's no evidence of psychosis in other animals, right? And I think it could very well be linked to a breakdown of what we regard as real. If you're regarding the wrong thing as real, you can see how this could quickly get out of control. So, like a bicycle can break down in some ways, but a car can break down in more ways. And since we shifted to this very complex architecture, we can break down in ways a chimp cannot. Okay, but what I really want to argue is that operators from one module could now operate on the operands of another module. So that these operators became in a way promiscuous or disencapsulated in a way that led to our crazy creativity. And I would argue that this initial change in working memory circuitries afforded by changes in what goes into an object file gave rise ultimately to metaphor, art, symbolic thought, music, abstraction, and syntax. So language, for example, might involve, operators that were initially for sequencing motor acts or navigation, but now could be applied to sequencing symbols internally. Symbols themselves could arise by holding two things at the same time in a given object file, that which is the real and that which it points to. Metaphor could arise, or analogy could arise when you are picking up on patterns like bigger than, that applies to this, but also links to other things that share that same relationship across modules. So the idea is that previously encapsulated operators could be volitionally applied to operands from other modules, and we could take something like, say, mental rotation, and volitionally manipulated in our mental workspace. We could take pattern operators from vision and apply them even to the contents of our memories, and suddenly we get a recognition of the patterns in our life, and that there's a death and all these things. And you can imagine how an animacy operator now applied inappropriately, really, to the weather could lead to gods, right? And you're having this seeing intentionality behind something that has no intention. And why would this get off the ground? Well, we were hunters. If I ask what does a lion do if it sees a bunch of zebra footprints, I'll tell you what it'll do. It'll do nothing, because footprints don't look like a zebra. They don't smell like a zebra, right? And that's what triggers a lion to go hunt zebras. But our ancestors could look at something that didn't look like what it is and make a link to a zebra and say, and then they could start seeing patterns behind the veil of appearances and say, well, the zebras, there's about 8 of them, and they were heading to that direction. Well, there's this, I can imagine the grassland there, about 7 hours away. They were probably heading there. So you can imagine how this would give our species this huge advantage to see patterns of causation and behind what is apparent that other species just didn't have. But the danger, again, is that you might see patterns that don't actually correspond to what's really going on, right? So, you might even say our species is kind of schizotypal as a baseline. Like we're kind of just crazy, because we're seeing all kinds of things. If everybody believes this crazy stuff, then that's okay, because it's normal. But I mean, it's still pretty crazy, and it leads to really crazy stuff like, oh, well, it hasn't rained in 6 weeks, so we have to throw a baby into the volcano, that kind of stuff. But our species is full of that. Okay. Now, how am I doing on time, Nick? Because I can get into some of the MRI.
Yeah, I probably have about 20-25 minutes.
Oh, okay. So good. I'm going to get into some of so all of these ideas now motivate, studies in the lab. In this case, I'll talk about some MRI studies from a few years ago. Right. So let me just talk about networks. Okay. So this is this nice stuff by Yo and Randy Buckner, where they just had the resting state of the brain, and they're looking at what covaries with what, and they find all these networks, right? This is a 7-network parcellation. You could do a finer scale parcellation, but you have the purple stuff corresponding to visual processing. You have the blue stuff there, somatotopic processing, motor control of the body. You have the light green stuff there, which is emotional, a regulation of emotion, maybe reward. You have the ventral attentional network associated with non-volitional shifts of attention and maybe the eyes. You have the default mode network, which we are familiar with, which is sort of our internal virtual reality machine. It's very much linked up with also social processing, because we're trying to envision this invisible thing, which is other people's intentions. The default mode, anyway, I might have messed up. Anyway, so this is the default mode network. And the reason that these things covary is they're actually linked by these axonal tracts, right? So it's really a system. Now the green one is one I'm going to be very concerned with. This is the dorsal attentional network involved with shifting the eyes and attention. And this is the frontal parietal control network, part of it. And it's associated with weighing options, selecting options, and implementing the selected option and staying on track. So this harkens back now to this beautiful paper by Dozenbach and somebody in Peterson, in which they argue that that attention is really, or at least volitional attention, is rooted in this sort of shared pair of networks. One is the yellow circuitry, which is the frontal parietal control network, and the other is the black circuitry there, which is the cinguloopercular network. And the way I think of it is the frontoparietal control network is very much associated with coming up with plans, considering options, weighing them, and saying, okay, this is the plan. And then the cinguloopercular network is involved with maintaining that plan. So you need both, right? I mean, if you're going to drive a car, you need a driver with a plan, but that's not enough, right? I mean, if you have a plan and you have a driver, but no gas in the tank, you're going nowhere. But if you have only gas in the tank and no plan or no driver, you're not going anywhere either, right? So you need both. You need a plan and you need oomph to get you to the implementation of that plan. So the yellow circuitry, the frontoparietal control network, is, I think of it as planning, executive control, considering options volitionally. And then the cinguloopercular aspect of that system is maintaining that plan versus others, right? So, for example, the dorsal anterior cingulate goes nuts when you do the Shroop task because it's trying to stay on task. It especially goes nuts, becomes more active when you make a mistake in the Shroop task and you're like, damn. But it's not just an error detection area, it's detecting an error in the service of getting back on track, right? So if you, I used to have a brain, oh, here's a brain, right? So if you look all along, God, okay, hold on. Get rid of the thalamus. Here we go. Right, so this is the medial surface of a right hemisphere. You know, all along here, you have cybernetic circuitry that's detecting different kinds of errors. Now, up here, it's cognitive errors, and that just gets you back on track, you know, in the Shroop task. But down here, it's social errors. In area 25, you might commit a faux pas, you know, like bringing salad with bacon bits to the vegan friend's house, and then they say, oh, I thought you were vegan, and you're like, oh no, oh, I'm so sorry. Like a normal person would be like, I'm sorry, man. But a person who's depressed will zoom in on that error and dwell on it for weeks or months and get consumed with self-loathing. So you have this cybernetic circuitry that's detecting different forms of error all along the cingulate and trying to minimize that error, get you back on track, right? But in each case, you need a plan and you need the implementer. And so they're in this shared or symbiotic relationship. So I would think of the yellow circuitry, the frontoparietal network, as sort of, yeah, the planner, decider, and then the cinguloopercular network is something like willpower, keeping you on track. And it's probably not a coincidence that it is tied up with the, so if you activate, so what's his name? Parvizi at Stanford activated, say, the dorsal anterior cingulate, and people said, I feel this incredible power, you know, and they said, then Parvizi says, yeah, well, what is the power doing? He says, I don't know, I just feel really, and so Hugo Critchley has argued that the dorsal anterior cingulate in this case is sort of the encephalization of the sympathetic nervous system. So think about it, when you want to implement a plan, you need to invoke the ability to, you know, carry it out, that fire in the belly. Yeah, the philosopher Schopenhauer said, willpower, so the dorsal, the anterior cingulate in this case, willpower is like a strong blind man carrying a weak-sighted man. You know, so the weak-sighted man would be the frontoparietal network saying, go there, go there, go there, but it itself cannot implement anything. Anyway, let's move on. Anyway, there's this beautiful paper, I love this paper by Jessica Andrews-Hanna and her group, in which they really break it down. And you can see the blue stuff in the upper left is different aspects of default mode circuitry. The green stuff in the upper right is the dorsal attentional network. Then you have the ventral attentional network in C, the lower left. And then in D, you have the frontoparietal control network and the cinguloopercular control network, which I was just speaking about. So the Dosenbach and Peterson circuitry. I would say the ones on the right involve volition. So we're going to really zoom in on those two, but especially D. So working memory, you know, again, I want to argue that working memory is not just maintaining nouns, you know, it's carrying out verbs, operations. And so, you know, this old view of Baddeley is, I think, kind of passé. You know, it's not just this simple executive doing either visual or phonological stuff. There's probably, you know, the old view is that there's the central executive there, and the DLPFC is sort of this master, and then you've got all these slave systems. So they got this master-slave relationship, very un-PC. And I think it's just wrong, or it's just simplistic. And then the other work on, you know, working memory really zoomed in on maintenance, you know, how many things you can maintain in working memory. There's been a lot less work on the operations you can execute in working memory. So again, you know, the field has really emphasized nouns versus verbs, and mental operations are really where it's at in our species. So we really need, as a field, to focus on mental operations. Okay, so I'm just going to look at 3 MRI studies that get into this stuff. So mental workspace. So the question was, you know, how do our brains make that? Well, you can't do an MRI study and say, you know, how does a brain make that, right? You got to think of something better controlled. So we came up with this idea to take some shape, like the upper left shape, and you can either do an operation like take it apart into its 4 quadrants, and there's a rule to that, or you can simply maintain it. So that would be the blue path. Or you can take the parts and you can just maintain them, or you take the parts and you can construct. So there's 2 operations. There's taking things apart from here to here, and then there's putting things together from here to here. And there's 2 maintenance cases, this to the same thing, or this to the same thing. So now you can ask questions like, where in the brain does this mental operation of putting things apart and putting them together and taking them apart happen? So you can look at the whole brain, and you need, you know, generally regions of interest. So we came up with regions of interest doing standard, you know, we just look, you know, where maintenance and operations differ. And then we define that as our regions of interest just to limit the search space. And then we'll do multivariate pattern analysis in that search space. And within that search space, we zoomed in on these 12 regions of interest. It's pretty standard areas. And then we simply asked, using MVPA, where can we classify manipulate versus remember? And, you know, basically occipital cortex, posterior parietal, dorsolateral prefrontal, precuneus, frontal eye fields, maybe even the cerebellum. We could classify manipulate, which is the thing that we're really interested in that case, manipulate, putting things together versus taking them apart. But you notice that classification makes mistakes in really interesting ways. So there's lots of information, not just in the hits, but also in the false alarms and incorrect rejections, right? So this is something that the field doesn't generally do, but should. You can squeeze more juice out of the lemon by zooming in on the mistakes that the classifier makes. So presumably, you know, if you have 2 operations like constructing from the parts or disassembling the parts, well, those are both operations. So that if you're going to make a mistake, you're going to confuse this with this rather than this with that. Similarly for maintenance, you know, if you're maintaining parts or maintaining the figure, well, you're maintaining in both cases. So if you're going to make a mistake, the classifier will probably confuse this with this. So you can create what's called a confusion matrix and look for areas that have this pattern of mistakes, you know, where operations are more confusable with each other, or maintenance is more confusable with each other. And you can do this for, you know, every area. These are the data. You can correlate it with that confusion matrix, that ideal confusion matrix. And you can create different confusion matrices. You could say, okay, like the one I just talked about, it confuses the operation, right? So where constructing and deconstructing are confusable, and maintaining are confusable. But, you know, you could also look at the output, right? So the output of from this to this is the same as the output of this to this. So you can either go from maintaining this to this as your output, or you can deconstruct this and get the same output. So then you can create a different confusion matrix for the output. And you can also create a different confusion matrix for the input, right? Because this is the same. You start out with this and then you go here, or you start out with this and then you go here. So you can look at what parts of the brain correlate in their confusion matrices with the input, followed by the operation, followed by the output. And you can, if you're lucky, get at the timing of the execution of an operation by looking at the correlation with these different confusion matrices. And so these 4 areas, we find we can actually see these peaks of the correlation with those respective confusion matrices. And because the test is so difficult, we made it intentionally difficult. So it would play out over seconds as opposed to hundreds of milliseconds. You get this beautiful unfolding of, peak correlation with the input, followed by the operation by the output in these areas. These are the key areas. Let's just focus on posterior parietal and dorsolateral prefrontal. That's part of the frontal parietal control network. But this area, the precuneus, and including also the posterior parietal, the posterior cingulate, seems to be part of the default mode. So it seems like this volitional circuitry is tied up with an aspect of this virtual reality circuitry when we volitionally do stuff in our imagination. So it's really not true that it's either the default mode or the frontal parietal control network. When you volitionally imagine, you're using the deciding and planning circuitry from the frontal parietal control network, but you're implementing it in this internal virtual reality, which is part of the default mode. So you can then look at patterns of connectivity. And when people maintain, you can see there's sort of this hub with the medial temporal lobes, probably tied up with the hippocampus. So probably the medial temporal lobe is some sort of hub for maintenance. But for manipulate, you get this dorsolateral prefrontal, precuneus, posterior parietal on both sides, seemingly involving this frontal parietal control network, volitional control over your internal virtual reality machine, which is your default mode network, which is tied up with the precuneus. So the PCU, the precuneus might be a kind of hub for mental operations, and the medial temporal lobe is a kind of hub for maintenance. So there's your DLPFC and posterior parietal with arrows, and there's your precuneus overlapping with posterior cingulate. Okay, so the story then is quite beautiful, I think. You have this top-down executive control circuitry, the frontal parietal control network, linking up with this aspect of the default mode network when you volitionally carry out operations in your memory. And so this is a version of the flow chart, according to Andrews Hanna, how it might work. You have your frontal parietal control network feeding back down into your default mode network. And here's a blown up version of that. Right? So this might be, one aspect of, at least the right part of that, of volitional imagination or deliberation. I won't talk about this because of time, but Schachter later then did a very similar study and found the same thing and made a similar argument, but I won't talk about that. Okay, so let's just summarize that. So there's, this widespread network involved in manipulating mental images, and we can even track the processing in the working memory core as it unfolds using that trick of correlation with the confusion matrix. Okay, right, and so then the pattern of connectivity depends on the mental operation in question. So the next study, I'll just go through this more quickly, zoomed in on the mental operation of mental rotation. And this is beautiful work by Shepard way back in the 70s, showing that the angle over which you mentally rotate something affects the duration of that operation, as if you're literally rotating something in an analog way in your internal virtual reality, which I suspect is true. And probably you're using the same operator as you would if you were using your hands. Okay, but Steve Koslin, went back and showed that mental rotation does recruit the motor cortex, suggesting that maybe, the operator that involved with actually physically rotating something in the world is the same operator that is used in your internal virtual reality. So we did a similar thing now where we had different types of shapes, either roundish shapes or angular shapes. And then we had operations. You could either rotate it this way or this way or this way or this way. So again, you know, if you're going to create confusion in the operations, you're probably going to confuse this and this versus this, and you confuse this and this. And you're probably going to confuse in the shapes, you know, things that are angular, and you're going to confuse things that are circular. So you can use the same confusion matrix trick to try to figure out, or extract more juice from the lemon and take advantage of the patterns of mistakes that the classifier makes. So this is the study. You know, people got a symbolic code, D meaning some shape and 4 meaning some operation, and then they would carry out that operation. And if the result of that operation was present in that array, then they would get money. Okay, so then you could simply look for where you can classify shapes and where you can classify operations. It's all over the place. But really what we're interested in is, can you get patterns of cross-classification? So this was a kind of a math problem. Okay, so it's actually kind of allied with the idea of hyperalignment, but it's not between brains, it's between areas. So you can create a classifier in one area. Can you use it to declassify in a different area? Well, that's a tricky problem, right? For one thing, this might have a lot more voxels than this. So how do you normalize things to have the same number of voxels so that your classifier can compare apples with apples? Well, that's a tricky math problem. So, you know, how do you go about doing this? Well, what you might do is, you know, train in some area, create a classifier for that area and test in a different area, say precuneus to posterior parietal. The precuneus has a different number of voxels, so you first have to normalize them to the same number of voxels. How do you do that? Well, you can put them all into a principal component space. You can rank order them, and then just take the top 50. So now you're doing your classifier over these principal components, and the dimensionality is the same. And so this allows you to get a classifier in one brain region and test in a different brain region. And so what's interesting is that for shapes, it seems to work pretty well, you know, creating a classifier in one brain region and then classifying in a different brain region. It doesn't work that well for the operation, you know, rotating this way or this way or this way or this way. But you can kind of look at this pattern of cross classifiability between brain regions, and there's really good cross classifiability for the shapes, relatively poor for operations, suggesting to me that there might be a shared shape code across brain regions, but not a shared operation code. Okay, and then you know, you can get really fancy, like my student Alex Schlegel did, and look at not only patterns of classifiability, but patterns of information flow. And so there's this thing called Granger causality mapping, which is, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, if the weather in Ohio yesterday was such and such, can you predict what the weather in New Hampshire will be like today? And of course, the weather in New Hampshire depends both on what happened in Ohio, but also what's happening locally. But is there any ability to predict? I mean, you can do a directed connectivity for all these different principal components. And so you can create a graph of Granger causality linkages between different principal components, and that's just a graph. And then you can use that and carry out your classifier over that, because, you know, MVPA doesn't care what it takes as its input. So now you can do MVPA over these really, really abstract things like patterns of Granger causal linkages. Anyway, if you do that, you get this sort of pattern of causation where, shown here, you know, but the one I care about is the operations, and that you can see it's going kind of from frontal stuff more downward, right? So DLPFC seems to feed back into the LOC and so forth. Anyway, I'll skip over that, but in summary, for experiment 2, there's information about both shapes and the manipulation or operation throughout the network. And there seems to be a shared informational format for shapes, not so much for operations. And there seems to be patterns of flow. And then finally, I'll talk about this one experiment, again, looking at the operation of mental rotation. And this was motivated by the idea that maybe it really is true that the operator that carries out a mental operation in your internal mental workspace or internal virtual reality is in fact the same operator that you use in the world, right? So what if we had people manipulate things in the world, like take a little object and rotate it this way or this way or this way or this way, and then we had them imagine that? Could we use the classifier created over the motoric operation to decode the mental operation and vice versa? So that's what motivated this. There's Shepard and Messler again. So we added into our existing regions of interest all the motoric regions of interest, those ones in yellow there. And we actually 3D printed out these little Shepard and Messler things, and we had people rotate them in the scanner. And so you can actually classify in the motor areas, as well as the same frontoparietal and precuneus areas, the mental operation. But this is the key slide, right? So here you're looking at cross classification, where you define your classifier motorically. People are rotating the thing this way or this way or this way or this way, and then you have them do mental operations or vice versa. And in certain premotor areas, you have this cross classifiability, suggesting really, I think, that the idea of embodied cognition is correct, that the physical operations we execute with our body in the real world become the same operations we carry out in our virtual reality or our imagination. And therefore, it should be really, really important for all people who are parents to make sure their kids are outside playing and using their bodies a lot, because that will then, I would think, affect their ability to carry out those operations later in life in their imagination. So if your kid is sitting at home just doing this all the time with a little screen, I don't know. I mean, it's an empirical question, but it might have downstream effects like hampered imagination downstream, or I don't know. Okay, so I'll try to wrap it up. This is just showing the pattern of cross classification again. It's quite widespread. Anyway, so for the last experiment, there's information about mental rotations throughout the motor network. The motor network is integrated into the mental workspace. We're using the same operation that we use for our muscles in the real world to carry out mental operations in our internal virtual reality machine, in our imagination. So there's crosstalk between the premotor areas and, say the frontoparietal control network and the precuneus. Right. Okay, so let me just conclude. The standard Baddeley view of working memory as a master controlling slave is very outmoded. It's not right. It's much more complicated than that and beautiful. This processing is quite distributed for shapes. Operations seem to be more encapsulated, so there are probably these modules. And then, these previously encapsulated operators seem in our species to be volitionally applicable to operands from other modules, allowing us to do things like invent umbrellas and eventually airplanes and computers. So I would argue, we're not just different in degree from a chimp, we're different in kind. We're at least 1 or 2 or 3 revolutions away. We're disencapsulated, we are symbolic, we're metaphorical, we're syntactic, right? And so I think we're just different in kind from any other animal. And this affords us, also getting back to the issue of free will, the ability to volitionally manipulate things in our internal virtual reality or imagination, and then going about and making it happen in the world. It could be like Orville Wright, lying in bed thinking, God, how do I build a better ornithopter? And then he lets go of the idea of flapping, and then he's like, oh my, I'll put a fan in front and suck the thing forward. Oh my God, I can do that. And he was just a bicycle shop owner. He goes and builds this thing, and at Kitty Hawk, he makes history, right? No chimps do that. So there's this ability, our wild freedom is rooted in our wild imagination. And it's both our friend and our enemy, This disencapsulation of operators that evolved for real operands when applied to internal virtual operands can lead to all kinds of stuff, both good and bad, right? It can lead, Anyway, so this is the stuff I circled in black there is, the frontal parietal control network, this volitional top-down network takes control of the default mode network for virtual reality purposes. And it leads to this crazy freedom that we have, but that crazy freedom can be like Icarus here and really lead to our own undermining. I mean, it can lead, Karl Popper said, this kind of consciousness evolved so that our hypotheses could die in our stead. But this volitional top-down control of the frontal parietal control network of the default mode network core set us free, I think, in a crazy, wild way. But it can lead to this. We can imagine this and do it. We can imagine this and do it. But we can imagine this and do that. And we can imagine a new educational system where people cultivate their minds. So our imagination, rooted in changes in how our brains work, is both our greatest tool, but also our greatest weapon. Okay, I'll stop there, everybody. Thanks. And these are the people who did the actual work. So I'll pass control back to you, Nick, and people can ask questions if they wish.
Thanks very much, Peter. Super interesting. Probably have a few minutes for some questions, so I'll open up to anyone who has a question. Emma, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing that. This was a really beautiful talk.
Thank you.
I am taking a class right now that talks a lot about embodied cognition. And just for background information, I'm an undergraduate student at UC Santa Cruz. And my professor keeps hinting at this idea that analog representation and embodied cognition is most useful and most applicable when somebody is learning something. And then after that is learned, it can be abstracted into a propositional representation. Do you think that with something like the mental rotation task, when you have these people like learning how to do the mental rotation task with like the physical object, and then they're able to practice and practice over time, that there would be like a practice effect that you would see like a decrease in activation in the motor cortex over time? Or do you think that the motor cortex is like permanently going to be involved in a task like that?
Yeah, so this really gets to the issue of mastery and what mastery means. So there's two basic ways of carrying out a process. One is volitionally, and the other is non-volitionally, or often titled with habit and automaticities. And I think attention is really key in the transmission, or the transformation from one to the other, right? So take a kid learning piano. Well, initially, you have a bunch of little black dots, and you're like, God, what do those black dots mean? And then that has to tie onto some hand pattern. It's very effortful, right? So attention can hold things together in working memory like glue. This is Ann Treisman's idea that attention is a kind of glue, but it is a glue that can harden. And with practice, you automatize the recognition of these 3-4 black dots as, say, a C chord, and you automatize the hand pattern for a C chord, and you automatize the link between that pattern and this pattern. And where's the limit of this chunking process? Well, say you're Vladimir Horowitz and you have good scaffolding in your life. You have a mother says like, Vladimir, practice. He's like, I don't want to, Mom, do it. Then the next level of chunking might be meta chunking. This is now a chunk. And then you have meta chunking and meta. Who knows where it ends, right? And a lot of this leads to the automatization of motor sequences, but thought sequences, emotional sequences, patterns. And so this is why it's so important to give children an environment in which they can fully realize their potential with good scaffolding, right? Because they're internalizing all their patterns, dysfunctional patterns too. I mean, all of us have. And if you automatize a bad pattern, that's really bad. Like anybody who's learned a musical instrument, you know, you learn this mistake, and to unlearn it is very hard once it has gone through the habit formation process. Might take years, right? So this is why good teachers and good mentors and a loving family are just so essential, especially before the age of 5, you know. So much of this stuff is happening by the age of 5 or 6 before kindergarten starts. So our society has to just completely change and not be focused on kindergarten and up, but zooming in on preschool, because so much of our patterns are formed then, and our automaticities. But we're never fully automatic, right? I mean, so an example I typically give is, you know, driving, right? You didn't come to the world driving, you know, but you have now automatized passing and braking and all kinds of stuff, such that you're on autopilot when you're driving, and then you free up your volitional attention to focus on other things, like, you know, God, why'd she say that to me, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But say something weird happens, right? Like a kangaroo starts skipping across the highway, and you're like, whoa, and you get shifted out of the, remember I said consciousness is kind of bifurcated, waking consciousness, and you're either in this virtual reality where you can either non-volitionally mind wander or volitionally carry out operations like who do I invite for dinner, or you're dealing with the world and your body in the world. And so this kangaroo jumps across the highway, none of your automatized schemas or you know, scripts can handle that. They can handle, you know, braking, and they can't handle a kangaroo. So poof, you switch back into the consciousness of, okay, how can I handle my options? I could honk, I could slow down, I could hit the kangaroo, I could swerve around it, I could all kinds of stuff. And so you need both this volitional mode and this non-volitional mode. The volitional mode is to consider options. Now it's slow, but it's incredibly flexible and can lead to a creative response that the automatized system simply cannot. And so a lot of this harkens back, I think, to Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development, right? So children are constantly expanding their zone of what they know or have, including what they have automatized. And then there's this zone of what counts as novel. And then there's sort of the great beyond of stuff that's so bizarre as to not even be comprehensible, right? But we're growing this, and our volitional attention is especially in this zone of proximal development. And this automatization, I think part of it is built into us in the form of play, right? So it seems like nature didn't know where to lay down the connectivities and said, okay, you know, like if I were running, you know, say your college campus, and I didn't know where to put the sidewalks, I would just put grass everywhere and let people walk around wherever they want. And then I look at what the trails are that form, and then I would put down the sidewalks. That's how evolution seems to solve this problem. It gives animals more neurons that they need, more, you know, tremendous flexibility. It lets them play. They have a desire to play. Then, when it's clear what the connectivities are that are actually used, you lay it down and you automatize it. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it definitely got at it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Maybe we have time for like one more question.
I'll try to be less long-winded. It's always an effort.
Jason.
Oh, Jeremy, you can go if you want. Oh.
No, you can go ahead, Jason.
Okay, well, thanks, Peter, for a really interesting talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I was kind of curious, connecting the first half to the more theoretical piece. You know, you started talking about unconscious processes and volitional control over conscious processes. And then you talked about this idea of kind of reality monitoring, that, you know, once we have these internal working memory processes, we need some way of separating what's happening inside our heads from what's a sensory stimulus that would have caused maybe a similar pattern of activity. I know some people like Hak-Wen Lau and Steve Fleming have kind of developed this idea that consciousness is critically tied to reality monitoring, that once you have the ability to tag, say some neural activity as being a real signal, as coming from the external world, then that's when you're going to be conscious of that signal. And I'm wondering how you think of that, and whether you think the evolution of reality monitoring or these top-down influences, is that critically tied to the evolution of conscious perception in some way in your mind?
Well, I mean, again, so our consciousness is bifurcated, if not trifurcated. Easily half of our conscious experience during the day is in this internal virtual reality, where we're imagining this, imagining that, either in a mind-wandering way or in a volitional way, trying to deliberate about whom to marry or whatever. And since we're conscious of it, and that might have nothing to do with what's going on in the real world, that can't be right. I mean, I'm conscious, for example, I can imagine stuff that I know has nothing to do with reality. Like I can imagine what it's like to be a dog, flying around Mars. None of that's going to happen. And it can't happen because I can't turn myself into a dog and can't get to Mars. But I'm conscious of it. So it can't be the case that consciousness necessarily, or it is necessary that it corresponds to reality. That's just not true, at least in our species. And, then take dreams, nobody thinks that dreams correspond to reality. Like a dog dreams, So even dogs seem to have some sort of internal virtual reality machine. But anyway, getting back to the reality tag, I mean, I do think we have this crazy, wild imagination. And if you start to think that that is real, you put your reality tag on the wrong thing, you're psychotic. You are in psychosis, or schizophrenia and bipolar are the price we pay for our wild architecture.
That seems like a great statement to wrap up on. So we're kind of at our time, but I'd like to thank Peter once again, and people who need to leave may leave, and if maybe a couple people want to stay and ask another question or two, and Peter is willing, we can do that. Sure. But thanks again, Peter.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, so anybody who wants to stick around, I'm all ears.
Jeremy?
Hi, yeah, really interesting talk. I guess my question was about, how you're thinking about demodularization and sort of how Fodorian you imagine modules to be. So like if there's this idea in sort of the classic, in Voder's classical sense, that you have an encapsulated module and it has its proper domain of inputs, and then it has its outputs, and then all of the operations that happen in between those two things are completely encapsulated and there's no sort of outside influence. It seems that, so in one sense, demodularization could mean that you don't have that kind of really strict modularization, the way that Fodor talks about it. The other way that it sounds what you're meaning is that what's actually happening is that the proper domain of representations that can be fed into that module has been expanded. So that like if a particular module evolves for a particular task, say thinking about space, and now I'm applying it to think about metaphorically about time, that's just an expansion of the kinds of representations that can be fed into that module. It's not that the module itself is being like decomposed and that it's no longer a module. So I wondered if you might be able to say a little bit more about what you mean by demodularization.
Yeah, so there's different ways to think about demodularization. One could be what you said, that there could be different or novel forms of inputs into that module. So take a posterior parietal network that is dedicated to processing spatial relationships. Now you can do that for friendships, and have near or far friendships, or near or far in time. And there's this very nice paper by Talia Wheatley's group showing that they can create a classifier for spatial distance and then classify social distance or temporal distance. So that's one form of demodularization. Another form of demodularization would just be the breakdown of modules, right? They are no longer encapsulated. And another form of demodularization would be that if we think of working memory now, not simply as maintaining things, but as a mental workspace that carries out operations over operands, the outputs of a module can feed into a mental workspace, and operators, which are also downloaded into that mental workspace, can operate on operands for which they did not evolve, right? Take, for example, and this can happen volitionally or non-volitionally. So take, for example, like how did art get off the ground? You know, so no cat or dog or any other mammal looks at the sunset. And we're this weird species that does that. Like everybody looks at sunsets, you know, why? Well, here's a guess. You have these, you know, innate operators assessing beauty, especially sexual fertility, often tied up with, you know, rosiness of the cheeks or certain kinds of symmetry. Now you inappropriately apply that fertility operator to things that are not human faces or bodies for which they evolved. So that could be a non-volitional way, and suddenly you're looking at a sunset like, wow, that's kind of erotic. I don't know why. But it could also happen volitionally, right? Anyway, so I think the point is demodularization can happen in several different ways, either in terms of the inputs to existing modules, the breakdown of modules, or the output of modules to a shared mental workspace where operators and operands could be combined inappropriately, you know, so that you're seeing intentionality behind the weather or the volcano, or seeing kind of fertility cues in things that are not human bodies or faces. And you could see that this kind of promiscuity or misapplication or breakdown of encapsulation of operators and their dedicated operands could lead to lots of interesting and crazy stuff like art and religion. So I'm not committing to any particular kind of demodularization. They might all have happened, I don't know. Mm-hmm. It's actually a tricky issue to come up with a killer experiment for, to really nail down which of those possibilities emerged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Let me ask you a question, Peter. So I had a question about, you know, this idea that when you perform a mental operation like rotating one of Shepard's cubes, it's kind of similar, involving the similar mechanisms as performing like a hand twisting rotation. But I wonder what you make about differences in affordances in terms of what we can mentally imagine and what we can physically do. So like I can do this, so I can have like one hand rotate this way and one hand rotate this way, or I could imagine like rotating my foot clockwise, not my hand. Yeah. So I guess I'm wondering, like, do we have one thing that can simulate rotation in our mind? Do we have it tied to different limbs? And how specific is it when we're making a mental rotation of an object? Are we using a general mechanism? Are we using a limb-specific mechanism?
So I don't know the specific answer to that. I mean, that makes interesting predictions, right? You know, if you find that you can do this or you can do this, but you can't do, I mean, there's lots of things we can't do, like we can't do this very well, right? That if you have people imagine, you know, doing this with two things or this, they can do it. But if you have them doing things that they can't, like if you have somebody having to move something vertically at the same time as horizontally, there might be this crosstalk in the imagination. I mean, I don't know if that's the case, but that would be a prediction of what you're saying. And somebody could go look for that. That would be very cool. Yeah, does that get at your question?
Yeah, it was more of just like a thought. Like there's, yeah, on one hand, you know, your physical body is limited. You only have so many limbs. You can only do so many independent things with them. In some ways, your imagination is more unlimited. You can imagine lots of stuff, but in other ways, it might be more constrained than the things you can do with your body. So I guess I'm just wondering about like the relationship between those two things.
Well, I mean, we can imagine stuff that we could never do in the world, right? So yeah. I can imagine, you know, I mean, some of it's sort of like edge cases, like I can imagine what it's like to be a woman, and then I can actually go kind of do an operation and accomplish that. But I can't imagine what it's like to be, you know, the universe and then do that, or I can't imagine what it's like to even be a frog and then do that, you know. So the imagination is, I would say, more unconstrained than our body. Yeah. Now, how does that happen? Well, you know, when I try to imagine what it's like to be a frog, which I do every day, you know, a lot. No, I'm just kidding. The question is, how do I do that? What is it like? You know, I mean, surely I can't really imagine what it's like to be a frog. But what do? I imagine being really small. I imagine, you know, slimy skin and. But yeah, how that actually happens, I don't know. You know, what are the actual mental operations that lead to me imagining what it is like to be anything that I'm not, especially the stuff that's impossible.
Right, right. So it's like the theory that we use, you know, we rely on similar mechanisms as we do to do physical things is okay until you get to the limit of things you can't do physically, but you can still imagine them in as vivid of a way.
Yeah, my guess is that our imagination is not, you know, godlike. Like when I imagine flying around, say, Mars, I have all these pictures of Mars that I've seen now from satellite, land rovers. I have all these experiences I have of flying around things, you know, in airplanes and helicopters, and I kind of imagine that. But probably it would be very different than I imagined flying around Mars. For one thing, I'd be choking to death. You know, I didn't have that in my imagination.